Now we are going to read The Grey Paw from the Penguin Book of Scottish Folktales. In the big church of Bowley, Eagles, Mahor, Namanachane, i.e. of the monastery, mysterious and unearthly sights and sounds were seen and heard at night, and none who went to watch the churchyard or burial places within the church ever came back alive. A courageous tailor made light of the matter and laid a wager that he would go any night and sew a pair of hose in the haunted church. He went and began his task. The light of the full moon streamed in through the windows, and at first all was silent and natural. At the dead hour of midnight, however, a big ghastly head emerged from a tomb and said, "Look at the old grey cow that is without food, tailor." The tailor answered, "I see that, and I saw this," and soon found that while he spoke the ghost was stationary, but when he drew breath it rose higher. The neck emerged and said, "A long grizzled weasand that is without food, tailor." The tailor went on with his work in fear, but answered, "I see it, my son, I see it, my son. I see that, and I saw this just now." This he said, drawling out his words to their utmost length. At last his voice failed, and he inhaled a long breath. The ghost rose higher and said, "A long grey arm that is without flesh or food, tailor." The trembling tailor went on with his work and answered, "I see it, my son, I see it, my son. I see that, and I saw this just now." Next breath the thigh came up, and the ghastly apparition said, "A long crooked shank that is without meat, tailor." "I see it, my son, I see it, my son. I see that, and I saw this just now." The long, foodless and fleshless arm was now stretched in the direction of the tailor. "A long grey paw without blood or flesh or muscles or meat, tailor." The tailor was near done with his work and answered, "I see it, my son, I see it, my son. I see that, and I saw this just now." While with a trembling heart he proceeded with his work. At last he had to draw breath, and the ghost, spreading out its long and bony fingers and clutching the air in front of him, said, "A big grey claw that is without meat, tailor." At that moment the last stitch was put in the hose, and the tailor gave one spring of horror to the door. The claw struck him, and the point of the fingers caught him by the bottom against the doorpost and took away the piece. The mark of the hand remains on the door to this day. The tailor's flesh shook and quivered with terror, and he could cut grass with his haunches as he flew home. The White Adder. The wonderful gift of seeing into the firmly sealed volume of futurity was supposed to be innate in some person, but the brew or broth of the White Adder had the same magical effect on the partaker as if he had been born heir to the gift. This was the manner in which Brocdarg, the celebrated prophet of the North, was endowed with the marvellous power of diving into futurity and of knowing the person who cast ill on their neighbours. Going to the continent in youth as the servant of a second Sidrafel, He got a white adder from his master to boil one day, and was admonished on the pain of his existence not to let a drop of the brew touch his tongue. On scalding his fingers, however, he had inadvertently thrust into his mouth as a soothing balm, when he instantly beheld the awful future stretch out before him. Fearing the ire of his master, he fled from his service, and domiciling himself among the native mountains in Aberdeenshire, was consulted by all the bewitched and lovesick swains and maidens far and near, and died an old wealthy carle about 80 years ago. Donald Dubhiel Mackay. Donald Dubhiel Mackay was a notable wizard in his day, and ought to be, for he studied the black art in Italy under a no less distinguished professor than Satan himself. The fee that this notorious personage demanded for his professional work was that at the end of the session, when the students would be dispersing, the last one to go out at the door should be his perquisite. On dismissal day, Donald happened to be the last to leave the room. Satan made a grab at him, but Donald protested that he was not the last, and, turning round, he pointed to his shadow and said, "They'll take the hindmost." Satan looked round and seized Donald's shadow, but before he realised its unsubstantiality, Donald was away. Donald's shadow was the only fee Satan got for that session's work. His education being now finished, Donald came home to the Ray country. The observant and sharp-witted people of his native district quickly noticed that he was uncanny, for they saw that he did not cast a shadow. Shortly after coming home, he went into the famous cave of Smoo in Durness, and was resolved to explore its subterranean recesses, where no foot of man had ever trod. He climbed the face of the cliff that forms the back wall of the magnificent outer cave, and entered the opening that gave access to the dark underground part of the cave. He found that a lake fed by a stream that poured through a hole in the roof barred further progress. But a man that was so clever as to outwit the devil was not to be balked in his purpose by an underground pool of water. A small boat launched on this pool would overcome difficulty. The tiny boat soon materialised. It was hoisted up into the entrance hole and pushed into the water. Donald and his dog went aboard. For some distance, the passage was narrow, and at one point, the roof was so low that he could not sit upright in the boat. He squeezed past the low narrow part and past the point where the stream was pouring through a hole in the roof into the cave. After passing these obstacles, the cave widened out and also increased in height, and after a few more yards, the boat touched dry land. He and his dog landed. As he was feeling his way through a passage dark as a wolf's throat, he heard a voice ordering him to halt. The dog had run on into the dark passage, a considerable distance in front of him, but he soon returned howling from pain and fear. And the dog got into the boat again, and in a few minutes more they were back into the light, when to his horror, Donald saw that his dog was stripped naked of all his hair. As Donald was leaving the cave, the Queen of the Fairies met him. She commanded him to give up all thought of exploring the cave of Smoo, and instructed him to go to a certain place which she named, where he would find a box, which he was on no account to open, until he would get further instructions. Donald went to the place and found the box, but disobeyed the injunction not to open it. Hundreds of fairies swarmed out of the open box and were calling out, "Work, work, work." To stop their clamour, Donald bade them go to the hillside and strip off the heather, twist it into ropes, and wind the ropes into large clews. With amazing rapidity, they went about this work, and the clews of heather ropes were tumbling down the hillside like a shower of gigantic hailstones. The hillside was stripped bare in no time, and if rumour speaks true, nothing ever grew on that hillside again. This job having been finished, Donald's imps were clamouring and insistently as before for work. While the fairies were busy at the heather affair, he was busy planning what to set them to next. It was believed that a pot full of gold was hid in the lock on the east side of Clash Briac in Brobster. To set his energetic workers the task of drying the lock would keep them for some time from being troublesome. And besides, there was a sporting chance of finding the pot of gold and making him the happy possessor of it. He accordingly gave the order to drain the lock. His fairies or imps, or whatever they were, laboured at their task with great vigour, and were making good progress, as may be seen to this day by the two hills, Craigmore and Craigbeg, formed by the rock and soil which they excavated from the canal that they were digging. One day, while the work was progressing satisfactorily, the Caroline of Clashbriac came along and shouted to the workers, "In the name of God, what are you doing here?" In an instant the labourers vanished. They could not endure the mention of the sacred name. Donald's rage was boundless. He picked up a spade, and there and then he split the cailleach's head with it. When the workers threw down their tools, a loud noise like thunder reverberated among the hills. The unfinished work is still to be seen in the form of a deep ravine, extending for about 200 feet in the direction of the loch, but not reaching it. On the north side of this ravine, there is a standing stone, with the top part of it cleft in twain. This is said to be the cailleach, with cloven skull now turned into stone. Donald and his workers often visited Caithness, and were always ready for a job. On one of such visits he came to the farm of Lifmore. It was the middle of the harvest season, but the weather was cold and stormy, and the harvest work was still undone. Donald undertook to cut the farmer's corn, to bind it in sheaves, and to stuck it, and all this to be finished by next evening. The morning came, but Donald was still in bed, and seemed to be in no hurry to begin the work. The farmer was becoming anxious, and went to his bedside and told him that it was a good harvest day, and that he would like to see him getting on with the work. Donald gave little heed to the farmer's remonstrances, and lay in bed till the evening. He then went quite leisurely to the field, hook in hand, and cut as much corn as would make a stock. He bound it into sheaves and set up the sheaves in a stock. He then clapped his hands and said, "Everyone like that." No sooner were the words uttered than stock after stock was springing up, and in an incredibly short time all the corn on the farm was in stocks. On that night there was a great cutting off feast and a high revelry at the farmer's house, and of course Donald was handsomely paid for his services. On another occasion he was on his way to Caithness, and it happened to be on a Sunday. When he came to the split stone at Drumholliston, he sat down on a boulder to rest, when to his surprise he saw Satan standing beside him with a beautiful set of bagpipes under his arm. While he was resting, Satan regaled him with some bagpipe music, after which they continued their journey to Rie. As they were approaching Rie, they saw the people gathering to church. Satan and Donald also made for the church, and having arrived at the sacred building, they took their stand at the door and tried to dissuade the people from going into a killjoy place like that, and urged them to recruit into Satan's jolly service. To the great credit of the Rie people, not one of them listened to Satan's appeal, or to that of his henchmen. The tradition does not say how this rebuff affected Donald's feelings, but evidently it did not break his heart, for shortly after, he turned up in the best of spirits at the house of a Rie farmer, and agreed to thresh his corn. In those days there were no threshing mills in Caithness. The threshing was done by flails, and the farmer was glad to avail himself of the services of Donald Duival's imps, and so avoid the drudgery of the flail. Donald went to bed for the night in the farmer's house. Next morning, the farmer, carrying out the instructions given him, had a considerable number of people assembled at the barn. One set of people was needed to loosen the sheaf bands and to throw the loosened sheaves onto the threshing floor. The other set was needed for removing the fresh straw and grain out of the way of the flails. Seeing that the fairies themselves were so efficient, it was not clear why they should bother with such a crowd of clumsy humans. The morning hours were passing, midday came, but Donald was still in bed. In the late afternoon, he turned up at the barn and gave orders to have everything ready for the threshers. Then he gave the mystic signal, and instantly many flails were at work. The men could not throw the sheaves on the floor quickly enough, and it was as much as the other set could do to clear away the fresh straw and grain. Early that evening, every screw in the cornyard was threshed, and Donald and his gang were ready for another bout of work, and before dusk on the same evening, they cleared another cornyard in the neighbourhood, and then disappeared. That afternoon lived long in the Rie tradition as the day of the big threshing, and it became an era from which local events were dated. By far the biggest job that Donald and his workers ever took in hand was the attempt to bridge the Pentland Firth. The bridge was to be made of ropes woven the sands of Dunnet Bay. Surely a sufficiently difficult enterprise, yet for a time it promised to be a success. In obedience to Donald's orders, his workers succeeded in making what was to be the main rope for supporting the bridge. When trying to manoeuvre it into position and getting it stretched from shore to shore, it snapped in the middle. The fairies were now raging at Donald for giving them work that transcended their powers. They turned on him in fierce rebellion and would have torn him limb from limb, but Donald was too clever for them. He quickly changed himself into a black horse and fled from them with lightning speed into the town of Fursaw. As fairies are not permitted to quit their job until it is finished, they were presumably fumbling along the Dunnet sands to this day and trying to twist them into ropes.